Long queues for food and other basic essentials. Sri Lanka's economic crisis is deepening. The government's announced emergency measures to tackle these shortages. Now, is the opposition right in calling them drastic and an attack on human rights? And does the island nation need major reforms to overcome its problems? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasia Tay. Now, everyday life for people in Sri Lanka has become a major challenge. Essentials like food, medicine and fuel are much more expensive, and that's if they're even available. This pandemic and a recession are being blamed, and a dramatic fall in the value of the Sri Lankan rupee is making things even worse. The island nation depends largely on imports for its food, and a weaker currency means they're now even costlier. The government has announced an economic emergency to ease the burden for millions of families. Now, we'll discuss the crisis with our guests very shortly, but first, Manel Fernandez has this report for us from Colombo.
Sugar, it's everywhere, but not a grain to buy, has been the complaint from consumers in Sri Lanka. The government says this is one of the reasons. Hoarding by traders to create an artificial price increase. On Wednesday, government officials raided warehouses in Colombo they said were not registered with the Consumer Affairs Authority and seized 32,000 metric tons of sugar.
These stocks will be made available to the public. We distribute it through government retailers at an affordable price.
Raids like this to acquire hidden stocks follow President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's decision to impose a state of emergency and introduce regulations on essential food supplies. Under these rules, authorized officers will be able to take steps to provide essential food items at concessionary rates to the public by purchasing paddy, rice and sugar, including guaranteed prices or based on customs value on imported goods, to prevent market irregularities. Consumers have had to deal with increasing prices as a result of a weakening Sri Lankan rupee and inflation. On Thursday, many queued at government retail shops to buy their essentials at cheaper rates.
It's very difficult. I usually buy 3 kilos of sugar and lentils, which last me 1 month. But now they're only giving us 1 kilo at a time, and I can't stretch it.
The government's decision to invoke a state of emergency has had mixed reactions.
Queues like this one to buy sugar, milk powder, lentils and other essentials are becoming a common sight as Sri Lanka struggles to balance consumer demand with increasingly dwindling foreign exchange reserves. The government says the state of emergency will help, but others are worried.
Among them, M.A. Sumandiran, an opposition MP who explained his reservations to Al Jazeera.
The power is given entirely in the hands of the president, who becomes parliament himself in the sense that he can make regulations that override ordinary laws. It's only subject to the constitution. So, arrogating those powers to himself, with the history of emergency rule this country has had for a long time, immediately alarm bells start ringing in our ears.
Importers we spoke to say they're not happy with the latest developments, but decline to comment on record. As the government works to address bigger economic issues, including debt repayment, inflation, growth, and helping its currency, many here just want their essential goods at an affordable price. Manel Fernandez, Al Jazeera, Colombo.
Well, let's now bring in our guests. They're all joining us today from the Sri Lankan capital, Colombo. Firstly, we have Ajith Nivad Cabral. He's the State Minister of Finance, Capital Markets and State Enterprise Reforms, and also the former Governor of the Central Bank. We also have Harsha De Silva, an opposition member of Parliament, and also the former State Minister of National Policies and Economic Affairs. And we also have Nishan Damel. He is an economist and the director of Verite Research. That's a think tank based in Colombo. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. Now, I really want to start with just how we got here. Minister Cabral, I know that your government is saying they're isn't a food crisis, there isn't any shortages, and that this has all been caused by hoarding. There are also reports at the moment of planned food rationing. Can you confirm that people will not be going hungry, and tell us what went wrong?
At the outset itself, I can confirm to you, people won't go hungry. And also the fact that the government has been taking the necessary steps to deal with any hoarding is also clear evidence that we are on top of the situation. There are challenges, especially at a COVID time, the problems of distribution, the problems of purchasing, the problems of getting it across to the people directly to their homes. So those problems are there, but we have still been able to deal with every one of those. And today, every single person is able to consume his food at the quantities that he requires. Yes, there have been a few shortages, particularly in the case of sugar, as a result of so many people hoarding. But your pictures alone show that it has been hoarded and in large quantities. There were as much as 100,000 tons of sugar already in the country, which has been imported using foreign exchange, but it had not been it was not been purchasable by people, mainly because traders have been hoarding it. So the government had to invoke certain laws to ensure that food items could come into the market, and that's what has happened. So we want to confirm that there is absolutely no food shortage in our country. Yes, there have been a few instances of some items of food being hoarded, and as a result, temporary shortage being created. But that also has been addressed. And so we can confirm to you that that's a thing of the past and it won't happen once again. And we are well on top of the situation, and the government is taking the necessary steps to distribute it all over.
Well, these are some pretty drastic steps, though, and I think we all acknowledge that there are some challenges and there is an economic crisis, and there are some deep economic drivers here of this crisis. I was looking at some of the numbers, so it looks like Sri Lanka's foreign reserves fell to $2.8 billion at the end of July. Now, that's down from $7.5 billion in November 2019, back when this government took office. And the rupee in that time has also lost more than 20% of its value against the US dollar. Nishan, let me throw this to you. What happened?
So I think, thank you for inviting me on this event. With regard to the rupee, I think the depreciation of the rupee is really a function not of high inflation in Sri Lanka. So it's not based on fundamentals. It's based on concerns really about the future and management of the economy, especially the reserves. So I think the fact that Sri Lanka lost access to international financial markets in December 2019, when the government made a drastic reduction in taxes, I think the financial markets and the credit agencies downgraded Sri Lanka. And that really shut off access to international financial markets and started the very speedy decline of the reserves. So as reserves decline, dollars have been in short supply for basic things like importation. And that shortage, like in any economic situation, shortage drives up prices. And really the price of the dollar going up or the rupee depreciating, which means the same thing, is driven by this sort of artificial shortage created by the government not being able to borrow internationally to top up the reserves that it has to expend to settle loans that are becoming due. So that's a very short, I think, quick assessment of the fundamental reason that there's a crisis.
Minister, I know you are shaking your head and you don't agree, and I will come back to you in just a moment, but I do want to bring in Mr. De Silva at this stage, because I know there has also been talk of foreign help, potentially even assistance or more assistance from the IMF. Mr. De Silva, what are your thoughts on that? How do Sri Lankans feel about foreign assistance? I know President Rajapaksa hasn't been too keen.
Well, one needs to be realistic right now. We must acknowledge that we are in a crisis. I am happy to hear the minister say that no Sri Lankan will go hungry. That's good, because none of us, whether we are in government or in opposition, would ever want to see that situation in Sri Lanka. The issue really is the ability for us to meet our external debt payments. Our reserves have fallen quite drastically. And as you pointed out, we are left with maybe a little over $2 billion. We did get some assistance from the IMF, which is the SDR everyone else also got. But that will be used up in the next few months. So the issue really is not one of liquidity. The issue is one of solvency. So when the government is using tools like temporary borrowings and swaps, that is not going to fix the problem. So whether it is the IMF or anyone else, I mean, I'm no fan necessarily of the IMF. All what we need to bring in is discipline and the confidence back in us so that we can get our ratings upgraded so we can have access back again to international markets. So if that happens, then we have breathing space. And after that, we can really address the fundamental problems that we need to in order to have sustainable growth going forward.
Minister Cabral, I saw the statement that you gave yesterday with the foreign minister. I believe you say the country's record is impeccable, but as our two other guests have alluded to, Sri Lanka was downgraded by credit rating agencies and as a result has this very limited access to international capital. So do you stand by that statement that the record of Sri Lanka is still impeccable?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And I must also tell you that although the reserves had gone down to 2.8 billion at the end of last month, it has reached up to 3.8 billion. And we also have another access that is possible from a Chinese swap, which is another $1.5 billion. So we essentially have around $5.3 billion. But the main point is not just only that. The main point is that we have sufficient monies to pay off all the external debt. And we are also ensuring that Sri Lanka's reliance on external debt is going to be reduced as time goes on. You see, by end of 2014, we had only about $5 billion exposed to the international markets when we had a GDP of 80 billion. But by 2019, that number had gone up to $15 billion and on a GDP of just 84 billion. So we had to now shrink that a little bit. And that's why this government has taken a conscious decision that we would like to have new inflows coming in, which are non-debt creating. That's why we opened out the port city. We opened out new investment opportunities in the pharmaceutical sector. We are having G2G kind of borrowings being now pursued in order to ensure that the reliance on markets is reduced so that our vulnerability is also less. So yes, we do recognize there has been a slight reduction in the overall reserve levels. And that is also not merely because of the reasons that were alluded by the other two gentlemen. It was mainly because tourism, which had a $4.5 billion inflow coming into the country, that was disturbed as a result of COVID. And naturally, that had to be addressed with other areas of reductions in the foreign exchange outflows, which meant that the reserve build-up was a little weaker than otherwise. But even so, our debt paying has been impeccable, as I mentioned. Even in 2019, people said we won't be able to pay the debts in 2020. We did. In 2020, they said we won't be able to pay it in 21. We did. In 21, they are saying again there is vulnerability, but not in 2022, but it will be 2023. So these kinds of stories we have heard before, I must admit. But every time we have seen that our management of these numbers and the reserves have been sufficiently done in such a way that we will be on top of the situation. So
Minister,
I can assure you that what I did mention at the press conference yesterday will be the same.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you. I do want to talk about how the world is seeing Sri Lanka as well, especially within the context of the pandemic. Right? We've seen the whole world struggle, but countries, as you say, who are very reliant on tourism have had really particularly tough. Now, tourism and travel have long been major contributors to the Sri Lankan's government finances. It's been the third largest foreign exchange earner, accounting for nearly 10% of GDP back in 2019. That was according to the World Travel and Tourism Council. But as we've been saying, the sector's been hit hard by this pandemic. The number of tourists arriving in the first 7 months of this year, since borders were reopened, has fallen by 96%. That's staggering. The country's received less than 20,000 visitors this year, much less than the 37,000 who visited last year until March before these lockdowns were imposed. The Sri Lankan government had aimed to draw in nearly 4 million tourists in 2020, along with $5 billion. Mr. De Silva, let me ask you, from your perspective, have these efforts been working? Are you optimistic about where this might go?
The tourism revenue is critically important to us. I agree with you. But the reality is for tourism to get back to where it was, unfortunately, it's going to take some time. People want to go on vacation, their children need to be vaccinated. And the whole world really, needs to be vaccinated. So I am not very optimistic that the tourism numbers are going to go up as quickly as the government is expecting it to. So therefore, we need to figure out, what else are our options? Where are we going to get the revenue in? Mr. Cabral said that they're waiting for foreign direct investments. Not every foreign direct investment dollar is going to stay in the reserves. They are going to be taken back out for various purchases of equipment and raw materials. So therefore, we are really facing an issue of, like I said, one of solvency. Now here, Mr. Cabral said, look, we will match the cash flow. This is not the issue. The issue is not one of liquidity that you can resolve with swaps and short-term borrowings. You see, we need to get our debt sustained again. Our debt sustainability is a function of how fast our economy is going to grow. And unfortunately, we've had so many shocks in the last so many years that our investment rates have not been good enough.
Indeed,
So
and we've seen that growth has been very, very sluggish. And sorry, sir, I do want to bring in Nishan here because I want to turn the conversation also to how people are actually experiencing this on the ground, everyday Sri Lankans. Now, Nishan, you're sitting in Colombo, and I imagine you're keeping an eye on the cost of basic goods for yourself and your family. I'm curious, how much has that changed in the last 2 years? Say, a bag of rice, how much did it cost then? How much does it cost now? And do you have access? Are you confident that you have access to essentials like food and medicine and fuel?
So I think, the central bank reports on the inflation rate, and inflation is somewhat higher than it has been in past years, but it's still in the single digits. That inflation is being reported. So people are experiencing an increasing cost, but more than that, I think people are also anticipating costs going up even more as the dollar sort of appreciates, or the rupee depreciates rather a lot. So a 20% depreciation of the rupee simply means that imported inputs, including medication, etc., are going to go up in price. So people are having a hard time with the economic slowdown as well, undoubtedly. And I think, that's not unusual. Every country has been through difficult times of COVID. And the main problem for the government, let me just say, with COVID and tourism, is to come out of it quickly, not be on a red list globally. So the way to recover from tourism is that, tourists need to stop fearing coming to Sri Lanka, stop fearing COVID in Sri Lanka. And for that, Sri Lanka needs to find a path out of the red list as fast as possible. Very few countries are in red lists, and Sri Lanka is one of them. And Sri Lanka and tourists also, I think, today fear the government's instability of policy. Policies with regard to quarantine, etc., have changed so rapidly and at such short notice that people are waiting, it out, I think, right now, because they're not sure whether after they make their travel plans, policy can change. So policy instability is also an important issue.
Of course.
I want to come back to what the minister said about prices on sugar and hoarding. In a competitive market, if the market it's not a monopoly market, hoarding does not make sense. So really, I think from a position of government, you have to solve the hoarding problem in two ways. Either you say there's something wrong with our market structure, there's not enough competition, because people can hoard only if you've given a few people monopolies, and that should stop. The second reason there can be hoarding is if the currency is depreciating so fast, people are not confident they can buy stocks needed for the future. So they hold back the stocks they have at present to make sure they'll be able to sell in the future as well. So, both are problems that the government can solve, not by trying to hunt down the people who are hoarding, but by trying to solve the problems that make them hoard. either because they have monopoly power and there's no competition, or because there's great uncertainty about the future and ability to buy where the rupee is going and access to buy at lower prices.
Now, I'm really curious about some of the other policies during this time that have also been put into place. And I want to get your perspective on this, because I see there's also been a big move towards organic farming in Sri Lanka. And also now, with these new restrictions, fertilizer and pesticide imports have also been halted. Now, farmers are saying that that means their crop yields are potentially going to be halved, literally slashed by half. That also has implications for food insecurity, as well as, I believe, your biggest export, tea, which accounts for, what, $1.25 billion a year, 10% of Sri Lanka's export income. Minister Cabral, do you stand by that decision?
Yes, very much so. You see, whatever speculation there has been, we have seen that there has been no shortage at all. In fact, the tea production has been up. So I think there is speculation that this will happen or that will happen. But at the end of the day, we have seen in every single instance that every month the tea productions have been up, the prices have been good, and tea has been generating the revenues that were necessary. So I think, yes, when there are policy changes as well as certain decisions taken by governments, there can be some adjustment that is needed. But at the same time, we got to understand that even though there may be resistance to such changes, that if the right policies are taken and then the necessary assistance is also provided, and the government is prepared to take the necessary steps to change that situation in case there are any problems where you need some new imports to be done with regard to mainly organic fertilizer, we are ready to do that as well. So we are confident that those numbers will be delivered, and the necessary revenues will be hit. So actually, we have to also understand that these measures have not been taken suddenly. These have been discussed for more than 10 years. And then once a decision is taken, then naturally that adjustment will pose some problems at the initial stages, but we are confident that that will also be adjusted very quickly. Just one more point with regard to the sugar debate that we had. You see, overall, we got to understand that there may be certain technical issues that need to be sorted out in an economic sense. But if there is no sugar in the market, then the government has to deal with it. And that's why certain times the government has been invoking the rules and regulations that were already in our statute books in order to deal with this situation. And now that particular difficulty has now been sorted out, and then we are now clear of that hoarding issue as far as sugar is concerned.
Okay. Now, Mr. De Silva, I want to bring you in here. I see that you disagree, and I know that you yourself were a state minister at one point dealing with economic affairs. We don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to ask you to briefly tell me what, if you were in government right now, what you would be doing differently.
Thank you. But before I say that, I mean, it looks to me as if we are in a parallel universe here. I mean, things are not rosy as just expressed by my dear friend, Mr. Cabral. People are having issues with their crops. I mean, if just drive around and speak to people, saying, look, our crops are, you know, in need of fertilizer, in need of pesticides. So therefore, this decision is not something that had been discussed for 10 years. In fact, in the manifesto of the president, he said this decision will be implemented over 10 years, but instead it was implemented overnight. So this is the ad hocism that we see in policy making. So that's the issue. And therefore, this country is facing multiple problems. You know, yes, the food issue, I hope it will be resolved. But you don't need a jackhammer to do what you can do with a screwdriver. I've been a legislator for the last 11 years, and there are enough laws in statute books that you can use instead of bringing emergency laws to manage the food crisis. When you do that, a very, unsavory message goes out of this country to the rest of the world. And we saw a lot of international press had reported some nasty stories.
Well, so much of this, as we've been saying, is indeed about perception and about the way that the world sees Sri Lanka. And we do hope that things improve. I know there are lots of challenges ahead. We are out of time, I'm afraid. So I'd like to say thank you to all of our guests. Ajith Nivad Cabral, the State Minister for Finance, Capital Markets and State Enterprise Reforms. Harsha De Silva, an Opposition Member of Parliament, and Nishan Demel, an economist, all joining us from Colombo. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Remember, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasia Tay, and the whole team, bye for now.